So I have a number written here. It's a 2, a 3, and a 5. And we already have some experience with numbers like this. We can think about what does it represent. And to think about that, we just have to look at the actual place values. So this rightmost place right over here, this is the ones place. So this 5 represents 5 ones, or I guess you could say that's just going to be 5. This 3, this is in the tens place. This is in the tens place, so we have 3 tens. So that's just going to be 30. And the 2 is in the hundreds place. So putting a 2 there means that we have 2 hundreds. So this number we can view as 235. Or you could view it as 200 plus 30 plus 5. Now what I want to do in this video is think about place values to the right of the ones place. And you might say, wait, I always thought that the ones place was the place furthest to the right. Well, everything that we've done so far, it has been. But to show that you can go even further to the right, I'm going to put a little dot. I'm going to put a little dot right over here, and we call that a decimal point. And that dot means that anything to the right of this is going to be place values that are smaller, I guess you could say, than the ones place. So right to the left, you have the ones place and the tens place and the hundreds place. And if you were to keep going, you'd go to the thousands place and the 10,000s place. But then if you go to the right of the decimal point, now you're going to divide by 10. So what am I talking about? Well, right to the right of the decimal point, you are going to have, find a new color, this is going to be the tenths place. This is going to be the tenths place. Well, what does that mean? Well, if whatever number I write here, that tells us how many tenths we're dealing with. So if I were to write the number, 4 right over here, now my number is 2 hundreds plus 3 tens plus 5 ones plus 4 tenths. So you could view this as 4 times 1/10, or you could write this as 4 tenths, not tens, 4 tenths. Or 4 tenths is the same thing as this right over here. So this is a super important idea in mathematics. I can now use our place values to represent fractions. So this right over here, this 0.4, this is 4 tenths. So another way to write this number, I could write it this way. I could write it as 230, let me do the 30 in blue, 230, 235, and 4 tenths. So I could write it like this, as a mixed number. So this up here would be a decimal representation, 235.4. And this right over here would be a mixed number representation, 235 and 4 tenths. But they all represent 200 plus 30 plus 5 plus 4 tenths. Let's look at a few more examples of this. So let's say I were to write the number. 0.7, and actually let me go one space even further to the right, 0.76. So what would this be if I were to write it as a fraction? So let's just think about the place value. We have our decimal point. To the left of the decimal point is the ones place. But I have a 0 there, so this is 0 ones. Now I have 7 tenths, so this is the tenths place. And then this is going to be this place to the right of that. We're going to divide by 10 again. So this is going to be the hundredths place. So let me write this down. This space right over here is going to be the hundredths place. So this number right over here is, we can rewrite it as 0. Let me write it this way. We could rewrite it as 0 ones plus 7 tenths plus 7 tenths, not tens, tenths, plus 6 hundredths, plus 6 hundredths, not hundreds, hundredths. Or we could write this as 0 plus 7 tenths. Let me write that a little bit neater. Plus 7 tenths plus 6 hundredths plus 6 hundredths, 6 over 100. So you could write this 7 tenths plus 6 hundredths is exactly what this is. You could say this is 0 ones, 7 tenths, and 6 hundredths. Now, another way we could write this, you might be tempted, well, look, if we wanted to write it as a fraction or talk about it as a fraction, I could ignore the 0. That's not going to change the value of this sum. But I could add the 7/10 to the 6/100ths. So how could I write 7/10 in terms of hundredths? Well, 7 over 10 is the same thing as 70 over 100. 7/10 is the same thing as 70 over 100. One way to think about it is if I have 10 times, if I multiply the denominator by 10, well, I can multiply the numerator by 10 as well and not change the value of it. 7/10 is the same thing as 70 hundredths. And then you could add 6 hundredths to that, 6 hundredths to that. And what will that give you? Well, that's going to give you 76 hundredths. 76 hundredths. So this number up here, a lot of people will call this, they might say 0.76, or they might call this 76 hundredths. 76 hundredths. This is the hundredths place. This is the tenths place. But each tenth is worth 10 hundredths. And you see that. This is you could either view this as 7 tenths, or you could view it as 70 hundredths. So this is 76 hundredths. And you could keep going to the right. If you go to the right one more space, you would get to the thousandths place and then the 10,000ths place. So you keep dividing by 10 each place you go to the right, and you multiply by 10 each place you go to the left. What we're going to do in this video is refresh our understanding of place value, but we're going to dig a little bit deeper and think about place value in the context of decimals. So just as a refresher, if I had the number 973, this should be review for you. We already know that this rightmost space right over here, this is the ones place. And if we move one space to the left of that, this is the tens place. Notice we went from ones to tens. Tens are 10 times as much as ones. And then we move one space to the left of that. We go to we multiply by tens again. We get to the hundreds space. And so this 9 doesn't just represent 9. It represents 900. Or we could write that as 900. Similarly, the 7 doesn't just represent 7. It represents 7 tens, or 70. This 3 represents 3 ones, so it actually does represent 3. But as I promised, we're now going to extend our understanding. And what we do is we put a decimal here, which you've probably seen before, at the right. And the reason why we even need a decimal is to really tell us where our ones place is. We say, oh, okay, if we go right to the left of the decimal, that's going to be our one space. Because once we start introducing decimals, we can introduce as many spaces as we want to the right of the decimal. And so let's think about those a little bit. When we went from hundreds to tens, notice, we divided by 10. When we go from tens to ones, notice you divide by 10. So what do you think this place over here is going to be called? Well, what happens if you take 1 divided by 10? Well, then you get a tenth. So, as you might imagine, this is the tenths place. And then if you were to go one place to the right of that, what would this place be? Well, it would be tenths divided by 10, or 1/10 of a tenth. So this would be a hundredths place. And then if you were to go one space to the right, and we could keep doing this forever, but if we were to go one space to the right of that, what would it be? Well, a hundredth divided by 10, or 1/10 of a hundredth, is a thousandth space. And so, for example, if I were to extend this number, instead of it just being 973, if I were to write 973.526, what do these numbers, these digits, represent? This 5 doesn't just represent 5. It represents 5 tenths. Or another way of writing 5 tenths, you could write it like this, 0.5. You just have a 5 in the tenths place. Or you could write it as 5 tenths. This 2, and I think you get where this is going, this doesn't just represent 2, it represents 2 hundredths. I'm just going to make it very explicit in this video so it's very clear. 2 hundredths. Another way to write that is you just write a 2 in the hundredths place. So we're going 2 spaces to the right of the decimal, or you could write it as 2 over 100, 2 hundredths. And so, for kicks, pause the video. What are all the different ways of representing this 6? Or what does this 6 represent? Well, this is 6 thousandths. 6 thousandths. This is thousandths. There you go. I could also write that as 0. Let's see, this is a tenths place, hundredths place, and then in the thousandths place I have 6. Or I could write this as 6 over 1,000. 6 thousandths. So big picture, place value, we can keep going to the right of the decimal, and we can start representing things that are, I guess you could say, more precise. We are told to write 7/100ths as a fraction and a decimal. Why don't you get some paper and a pencil out and see if you can do that before we do it together. All right, so let's do it first as a fraction. So what is going to be the denominator of our fraction if they're saying 7/100ths? And the way I'm saying it is a little bit of a hint. 7/100ths. Well, I think you got the picture. We're dealing with hundredths. So our denominator is going to be 100. And then how many hundredths do we have? Well, we have 7 of them. I'll do that in a different color just to be clear. We have 7 of those hundredths. So there you have it, 7/100ths. That's this expressed as a fraction. Now, what about as a decimal? Well, we could think about our decimal places. If, let's say that this is the ones place, and I'm just putting a little blank here. So it's ones place, and you have a decimal right over here. And then this would be the tenths place. And then this would be the hundredths place. Well, we want to represent 7/100ths. So let me be clear. This right over here is ones. This is tenths. And this is hundredths. I like saying, it's unusually fun to say that. Hundredths. All right, ones, tenths, hundredths. So how many ones do we have here? Well, we have no ones. We have 0 ones. How many tenths do we have here? Well, we have no tenths. How many hundredths do we have? Well, we have 7 hundredths. Okay, now it's getting annoying. We have 7 hundredths. So you could write it that way as well. And if I wanted to just write it a little bit cleaner, I could just write no ones, no tenths, and 7 hundredths. I said it the last time like a normal person. Let's do another example. Here we're told select the written form of each number. And so on the left, right over here, you have different representations. Here we have things written as a decimal, a fraction, another decimal. And then we want to say, hey, which of these are represented in words or a combination of numbers and words up here? So pause this video and have a go at this as well. Okay, so this first number right over here, we have no ones. And then as we go one space to the right of the decimal, this is the tenths place. And it's clear we have 4 of those tenths. So this right over here is 4 tenths. So that is this choice right here. So I'll shade it in. If you're doing this on Khan Academy, you would just click there and it would fill in. So what about this one? Well, this one we would read. You have 4 out of 10 or 4 tenths. So this again would be 4 tenths. So we would shade that one in. Now what's going on over here? We have no ones, we have no tenths, but we have 4 hundredths. I said it again. It's too much fun. So we have 4 hundredths. So that's this column. So we would fill that one in. And we're done. Let's say that I had the number 0.17. How could I say this number? I said it one way. I said 0.17, but what are other ways that I could say it, especially if I wanted to express it in terms of tenths or hundredths or other places? And like always, try to pause the video and try to think about it on your own. All right, so there's actually a couple of ways that we could say this number. One is just to say 0.17. Other ways are to say, look, I have a 1 in the tenths place, so that's going to be 1 tenth, and 1 tenth, and I have a 7 in the hundredths place. So this is a 7 right over here in the hundredths place. So I could say 1 tenth and 7 hundredths. hundredths. And there you go. That's one way to say this number. Now another way to think about it is just say the whole thing in terms of hundredths. So a tenth is how many hundredths? Well, a tenth is the same thing as 10 hundredths. So you could say, instead of a tenth, you could say this is 10 hundredths. And the way I'm writing it right now, very few people would actually do it this way. 10 hundredths and 7 hundredths. And 7 hundredths. Well, now I could just add these hundredths. If I have 10 hundredths and have another 7 hundredths, that's going to be 17 hundredths. So I could just write this down as 17 hundredths. And to make that intuition of how we could just call this 17 hundredths instead of just calling it 1/10 and 7 hundredths, let's actually count by hundredths. So that is 1/100th, that is 2/100th, and actually let me just go straight to 9 hundredths. So I've skipped a bunch right over here. And what would be the next? How would I say 10 hundredths? Well, 10 hundredths, let me write it this way. 10 hundredths is the same thing as 1/10. So if we go from 9 hundredths, the next, if I'm counting by hundredths, the next one's going to be 10 hundredths. Now, once again, 10 hundredths is the same thing as 1/10. Just the same way that 10 ones is the same thing as 1/10. I hope that doesn't confuse you. But we could keep counting. 10 hundredths, 11 hundredths, 12 hundredths, 13 hundredths, 14 hundredths, 15 hundredths, 16 hundredths, and then finally 17 hundredths. So hopefully that gives you a little intuition for why we can call this number, instead of just calling it 0.17 or 1/10 and 7 hundredths, we could call this 17 hundredths. So with that out of the way, let's do a couple of examples going the other way. Let's say we're given a name of a number, or the words, and we want to write it down as a decimal. So this is 4 tens and 3 hundredths. All right, so 4 tens. So the 4 tens right over here. So actually, let me just put some places over here. So this would be, if this is our tens place, and then this is our ones place, and then you're going to have your decimal, and then you're going to have your tenths place, and then you're going to have, and I'll do this in a different color, your hundredths place, hundredths place. So we're going to have 4 tens, not tenths, 4 tens. So 4 tens, 0 ones, 0 ones. We got our decimal. They don't have any tenths over here, so 0 tenths. And then we have 3 hundredths, 3 hundredths. So 3 hundredths. So 4 tens, which is the same thing as 40, and 3 hundredths right over here. So 40.03. Let's do another one of these. This is kind of fun. So we have 24 hundredths. 24 hundredths. So by the logic that we saw in the first one, we could just write this as, remember, this would be 9 hundredths, and if we went one more hundredth, this would be 10 hundredths. So if we want to do 24 hundredths, it would just be 0.24. And if you're saying, well, wait, this looks like 2 tenths and 4 hundredths, you'd be right. But remember, so actually I could rewrite this as 2 tenths, and 4 hundredths. Let me say, and 4 hundredths. But remember, a tenth is equal to 10 hundredths. So 2 tenths is the same thing as 20 hundredths. Hundredths. I have trouble saying it. So this is the same thing as 20 hundredths and 4 hundredths. And 4. Let me write it neatly. 4 hundredths. And of course, 20 hundredths and 4 hundredths is the same thing as 24 hundredths. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's say I have the number 905.074. So how could I expand this out? What does this actually represent? So let's just think about each of the place values here. The 9 right over here, this is in the hundreds place. This literally represents 9 hundreds. So we could rewrite that 9 as 9 hundreds, or let me write it two ways. We could write it as 900, which is the same thing as 9 times 100. Now this is 0, that's just going to represent 0 tens, but 0 tens is still just 0, so we don't have to really worry about that. It's not adding any value to our expression or to our number. Now we have this 5. This 5 is in the ones place. It literally represents 5 ones, or you could just say it represents 5. Now if we wanted to write it as 5 ones, we could say, well, that's going to be 5 times 1. So far we've represented 905. 900 plus 5, or 9 times 100 plus 5 times 1. And you might say, hey, how do I know whether I should multiply or add first? Should I do this addition before I do this multiplication? And I'll always remind you, order of operations, in this scenario, you would do your multiplication before you do your addition. So you would multiply your 5 times 1 and your 9 times 100 before adding these two things together. But let's move on. You have another 0. This 0 is in the tenths place. This is telling us the number of tenths we're going to have. This is 0 tenths, so it's really not adding much. Now or it's not adding anything. Now we go to the hundredths place. The hundredths place. So this literally represents 7 hundredths. So we could write this as 7 hundredths, or 7 times 100th. So plus 7 times 100th. And then finally we go to the thousandths place. So we go to the thousandths place, and we have 4 thousandths. So that literally represents 4 over 1,000, or 4 times 1,000th. 4 times 1,000th. Notice, this is coming from the hundreds place. This is coming from the hundreds place. You have 0 tens, but I'll write the tens place there just so you see it. So it's 0 tens, so I didn't even bother to write that down. Then you have your ones place. You have 5 ones. Then you have 0 tenths, so I didn't write that down. Then you have 7 hundredths, and then you have 4 thousandths, 4 thousandths. So, and we are done. We've written this out, really just understanding what this number represents. We're told that each square below represents one whole. So this square is a whole, this is another whole, so together that's 2. And then we have something less than a whole. And they say what decimal is represented by the shaded area. So it's going to be 2 and then something. So it's going to be 2 point something. And let's think about what we have over here. This is 1 whole, 2 wholes. And then over here, we've taken a whole and we've divided it into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 equal sections. So we've divided it into tenths. Each of these bars is equal to a tenth, and we have 7 of them shaded in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this right over here is 7 tenths. So this is going to be 1, 2, and 7 tenths. So if we wanted to write it as a mixed number, we'd write it as 2 and 7 tenths. But they say what decimal is represented by the shaded area. So instead of writing 2 and 7 tenths, we could write 2.7. Because the space immediately to the right of the decimal points, that's the tenths place. So we have 2 ones, 2 wholes right over here, and then we have 7 tenths. This is the tenths place. And we could check our answer, and we got it right. Let's do another one of these. So same thing. What decimal is represented by the shaded area? So we have 3 wholes, and then this whole is divided into tenths. Now it's divided into these vertical bars. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 vertical bars. They're equal, so there it's divided into tenths. And we've shaded in 5 of them. So this one over here is 5 tenths. So it is 3 wholes and 5 tenths. So it's going to be 3 wholes. And in the tenths place, we would put 5. 3.5. 3 wholes and 5 tenths. We can check our answer. Got it right. Let's do a few more of these. What decimal is being represented by the shaded area? So over here, let's see, I have 100 squares. You see I have 10 columns, and each of them have 10 squares in it. So 10 times 10 is 100. So I have 100 squares here, equal squares. So I've divided it into hundredths, and I've shaded in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of the hundredths. So how do I represent that? So 0, that's the ones place. That's the tenths place. And now I'm in the hundredths place. And so we have 9 of the hundredths shaded in. So this right over here would be 9 hundredths, which is exactly what we have there. All right, let's do one more of these. All right, well, it's the same thing. We have 2 of the hundredths filled in. So I'll write 0. If I did that, that would be 2 tenths. That's not what we have filled in. We have 2 hundredths filled in. So this is 0.02, and we're done. We're asked, which 2 of the following expressions have the same value as 8.76? Pause this video and see if you can figure this out on your own. All right, now let's do it together. And before I even look at these choices, I'm just going to really understand what this number represents. And let me just rewrite it. So we have 8.76. So there's a couple of ways that we could think about it. We can look at our place values. This right over here, this is the ones place. This right over here, this is the tenths place. And this right over here is the hundredths place. And so we could view this as 8 ones and 7 tenths and 6 hundredths, or 8 ones plus 7 tenths plus 6 hundredths. Well, that's exactly what they wrote right over here. 8 ones, 7 tenths, and 6 hundredths. So I would choose that one for sure. Now this second choice looks like an expanded form, but before I even look at it, let's see how we would think about it over here. If we wanted to essentially write the same idea but in expanded form, 8 ones is the same thing as 8 times 1. And actually let me color code it so you see where things are coming from. So 8 ones, that's the same thing as 8 times 1. And to that, we would add 7 tenths, so that's plus 7 times 1 tenth, so 7 tenths, plus, and I'll do this in this orange color, 6 hundredths, so that's plus 6 times 100th, 6 hundredths. So this would be this number in expanded form. Is that what they put right over here? Yes, it is indeed what they put right over here. So I will circle that in. Now, if you're doing this on your own, we know that we just picked 2 answers. But let's see whether these other forms, or let's see if we can write this in these other forms and see how these might not be the exact answer. So if we were to write this out and take out each of the decimal parts, so the 8 ones, you would just write that as 8. The 7 tenths, well, that would be plus 0.7. This is 7 tenths right over here. This and this part right over here are all equivalent. And then last but not least, you have your 6 hundredths. So plus, so that's our ones, that's our tenths, and then we're in our hundredths place, and we're going to have 6 of them. So this would be equal to our original value, but that's not what they wrote over here. They did write 8 ones, they did write 7 tenths, but they did not write 6 hundredths here. They wrote 6 thousandths here. So we can rule that one out. And then if we were to write it out in words, we would say this is 8, and I'll do and in a neutral color. Now, you might say and 7 tenths and 6 hundredths. Or you could often, what's normally is you express it in the lowest place that you have, or the most precise place that you have. So you could view 7 tenths as 70 hundredths, or you could view this whole thing as 76 hundredths. So it could be 8 and 76 hundredths. But what they wrote over here, they did write 8, but instead of 76 hundredths, they wrote 8 and 67 hundredths. A little tricky. So we would rule that one out as well. What we're going to do in this video is explore place value involving decimals. And in particular, we're going to think about how you can regroup value from one place to another, which is going to be very useful later in your life when you start doing some more arithmetic with decimals. So let's first think about what this number is right over here. So each square represents a 1 or represents a whole. So what number is this? Well, you could see that we have 3 whole ones, so we could write 3. And then we have right over here, a whole is divided into 10 equal bars, these vertical bars. And so each of these are a tenth, and 4 of them are shaded in. So it's 3 ones, 4 tenths. And in this part right over here, we've divided a whole into 100 equal sections. It's a 10 by 10 grid. And we can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them are shaded in. So this represents 7 hundredths. So this is 3.47, or 3 and 4 tenths and 7 hundredths, or 3 and 47 hundredths. Now what we're going to do is explore how are other ways you can put the value into the different places. So let me set up a little table here. I don't think I'm going to need all that space. But we have, in this first example, so we have our ones place, we have our tenths place, and we have our hundredths place. I had to curve up a little bit. And so what we just did is we said, hey, this was pretty straightforward. This was 3 ones, 4 tenths, and 7 hundredths. But are there other ways that we could look at it? For example, is there a way of reimagining this? So instead of 3 ones, we have 2 ones, and we still have 7 hundredths. So how many tenths would we have in order for it to be the same value? Pause this video and think about that. All right, we'll do it together, and to help us, I will put what we had here just now. Now what's different, instead of having 3 ones, we now have 2 ones. So we could say that these are our 2 ones right over here. Our 2 ones. We have our 7 hundredths right over here. So essentially we would have to express all of this in terms of tenths. So how would we express it all in terms of tenths? Well, this, what used to be a 1, this is equivalent to 10 tenths. Let me make that very clear. Let me see if I could shade this in with that green color. So there you go. I'm going to shade it with the green color, and then let me draw a bunch of lines here to make it very clear. So I'm just going to hand draw it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Did I do that right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And I didn't draw it as straight as I need to. They really should be 10 equal sections, but it was hand-drawn, so I think you understand. And so look, notice, I took the exact same value, but I have regrouped. I have regrouped this 1 right over here into tenths. And so how many tenths are here? Well, now I have 10 plus 4 tenths. So now I have, shaded in, 14 tenths. That was interesting. Let's do another example. So now let's imagine another scenario. Let's imagine a scenario where we have 3 ones again, but this time, instead of having 7 hundredths, we have 27 hundredths. So in that circumstance, how many tenths would we have? Pause this video and see if you can work it through. All right, well, let's get that same number again. And now let's think about how we might have to regroup between the places. So we have our 3 ones. So that was just like the first case right over there. So we have our 3 ones. But now we have 27 hundredths. So in addition to these 7 hundredths, we have to find another 20 hundredths someplace. Well, the most natural place to go would be right over here. And 20 hundredths is the same thing as 2 tenths. So what we want to do is we would convert these 2 tenths into hundredths. And so let me actually just shade it in a little bit. So I'm going to convert this right over here to hundredths. And so there, did I do that right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And so there you have it. This plus this gives us our 27 hundredths. And so how many tenths do we have left? We have 2 tenths. 2/10. So in this situation, we regrouped 2 from the tenths place, and we expressed them as hundredths. So 2/10 became 20 hundredths, add it to the 7 hundredths that you already have, and we now have 27 hundredths. Hopefully that makes sense.